If you stand on the banks of the Mississippi River in South St. Louis and look south, you'll see something that looks less like a factory and more like a medieval kingdom. A sprawling, 142-acre fortress of deep red brick, ornate clock towers, and wrought iron gates. This is the Anheuser-Busch Brewery, the birthplace of Budweiser and the cathedral of American beer. To understand the scale of this place, you have to realize it's not just one building. It's a city of 137 structures. In the late 19th century, while the rest of St. Louis was built of wood and limestone, this complex rose like a Romanesque monument to German ambition. The air here doesn't just smell like industry. It smells thick and sweet, a heavy, toasted aroma of barley, hops, and history that has hung over these streets for over 160 years. But this wasn't always a kingdom. In 1852, it started as a struggling local operation called the Bavarian Brewery. It was failing, drowned in debt, until a soap manufacturer named Eberhard Anheuser took it over. Eberhard knew soap, but he didn't know beer. That changed when his son-in-law, a young, charismatic German immigrant named Adolphus Busch, entered the picture. Adolphus didn't just want to make beer for the neighborhood. He wanted to quench the thirst of an entire continent. He looked at the limestone caves beneath the St. Louis soil, natural refrigerators perfect for aging lager, and saw a gold mine. This factory became the laboratory where the king of beers was born. Walking through these gates in the early days was like entering a different world. You'd hear the thunder of thousands of wooden barrels being rolled across cobblestones and the rhythmic clip-clop of massive horses. This is where a small family business began its transformation into a global empire. It's the story of how two men turned a failing brewery into the most famous landmark in the American Midwest, a place where tradition was brewed with the cold precision of the future. In the late 1800s, beer was a strictly local affair. Because there was no way to keep the liquid cold during transport, a brewery could only sell as far as a horse and wagon could travel in a single afternoon. If you lived in Chicago or New York, you simply couldn't drink a beer made in St. Louis. It would spoil long before it reached your glass. But Adolphus Busch refused to be confined by the geography of heat. He realized that if he wanted to conquer America, he had to conquer the sun. In the 1870s, Busch did something that changed the food and beverage industry forever. He invested in a fleet of refrigerated railcars. These weren't just wooden boxes. They were high-tech marvels of the age, packed with blocks of ice and insulated with sawdust. For the first time, a train could leave the St. Louis yard and travel hundreds of miles, delivering beer that was as crisp and cold as the moment it left the cellar. But ice wasn't enough. Adolphus was also one of the first to embrace pasteurization, a process people usually associated with milk. By flash heating the beer to kill bacteria before bottling it, he ensured a shelf life that his competitors couldn't dream of. While other brewers were fighting for their local neighborhoods, Busch was looking at a map of the entire United States. Then, in 1876, he launched his secret weapon, Budweiser. Unlike the heavy, dark Ales common at the time, Budweiser was a lager, light, golden, and incredibly easy to drink. It was designed specifically for the American palate and the American climate. Back at the factory, the expansion was frantic. To keep up with the national demand, they built a massive glassworks to blow their own bottles and a private rail line to move the millions of cases. The Red Castle was no longer just a brewery. It was the headquarters of a cold chain revolution. By the turn of the century, Anheuser-Busch was shipping 1 million barrels of beer a year. Adolphus Busch had successfully turned the Mississippi River into a highway for the king of beers, proving that with enough ice and enough ambition, no market was too far away. By the early 1900s, the Anheuser-Busch Brewery had become a symbol of Gilded Age opulence. Adolphus Busch lived like royalty, and he treated his brewery like a palace. He didn't just build functional spaces. He built the brew house, a cathedral of copper and marble. Inside, massive chandeliers hung from vaulted ceilings, and sunlight poured through stained glass windows, illuminating giant copper kettles that held thousands of gallons of liquid gold. To work here was to be part of an industrial elite. But the most iconic symbol of the brewery's power wasn't made of brick or copper, it was made of muscle and bone. This was the era of the Clydesdales. In a time before reliable trucks, these massive, gentle giants were the heavy lifters of the empire. Busch was obsessed with quality, and that extended to his horses. He built them a stable that was more luxurious than most human hotels, featuring mahogany stalls and brass fixtures. The sight of a hitch of 8 Clydesdales thundering down the cobblestone streets of St. Louis, pulling a wagon stacked high with wooden barrels, became the ultimate advertisement. It represented strength, tradition, and a relentless forward motion. The sound of their massive hooves, each one the size of a dinner plate, striking the pavement was the heartbeat of the South Side. The factory was now a self-sustaining city. It had its own cooperage to build barrels, its own printing press for labels, and its own power plant. The Busch family created a culture of extreme loyalty. They built parks, sponsored bands, and ensured that the brewery was the center of social life for thousands of families. As the 20th century dawned, the red brick fortress looked invincible. Wealth was flowing as fast as the beer, and the king of beers sat comfortably on his throne. But a storm was gathering on the horizon, a movement that didn't care about tradition or gilded kettles. A movement that wanted to dry up the Mississippi and lock the gates of the Red Castle forever. The era of Prohibition was coming, and the king was about to face his greatest fight for survival. In 1920, the music stopped. The 18th Amendment was signed, Prohibition became the law of the land, and almost overnight, the fourth largest industry in America was declared a criminal enterprise. For hundreds of breweries across the country, this was the end. They locked their doors, sold their kettles for scrap, and faded into history. But at the Red Castle in St. Louis, the Busch family refused to surrender. August A. Busch Sr., who had taken over after his father Adolphus passed away, looked at his silent, 142-acre empire and made a vow: "We will not close." To survive, the world's most famous brewery had to become the world's most creative chameleon. The massive copper kettles that once brewed Budweiser were scrubbed clean to produce Bevo, a non-alcoholic cereal beverage that promised the taste of beer without the kick. But they didn't stop there. The factory was sliced into dozens of different businesses. One wing of the brewery began producing baker's yeast, a move so successful that Anheuser-Busch eventually became the largest provider of yeast in the nation. Another section turned to malt syrup, which was marketed for baking, though everyone knew it was being used by home brewers in dark basements across the country. They made ice cream. They made ginger ale and root beer. They even converted their high-end cabinet-making shops, the ones that used to build bars and saloon fixtures, into a division that manufactured truck bodies and refrigerated cabinet. But the hardest part wasn't the machinery, it was the horses. The famous Clydesdales, once the proud symbols of a golden empire, were relegated to farm work or kept as expensive pets in the family's private stables. For 13 long years, the king of beers was a king in exile, living off yeast and soda, waiting for the world to come to its senses. It was a period of eerie quiet in South St. Louis. The smell of boiling hops was gone, replaced by the scent of baking bread and sugar. But inside those red brick walls, the core engineering remained intact. They kept the boilers hot and the pipes clean. They weren't just making yeast. They were maintaining a sleeping giant, waiting for the moment the law would break so they could pour the first glass of a new era. On the stroke of midnight, April 7, 1933, the Great Dry finally ended. But while other breweries were scrambling to find bottles or clean their rusted tanks, the Red Castle was ready to explode. For months, under a special government permit, the Busch family had been brewing in secret, filling thousands of barrels and millions of bottles, waiting for the clock to strike 12. The scene in St. Louis that night was pure electric chaos. Thousands of people swarmed the gates of the brewery, cheering as the massive floodlights illuminated the red brick towers. At exactly 12:01 a.m., the heavy iron gates swung open, and the first truck rolled out. The king was back. But the most iconic moment of the rebirth didn't involve a truck. To celebrate the end of Prohibition, August A. Busch Jr. presented his father with a surprise: a hitch of 8 magnificent Clydesdale horses pulling a gleaming red beer wagon. It was the return of the legend. These horses didn't just walk through St. Louis. They were sent to the White House to deliver a case of Budweiser to President Franklin D. Roosevelt. The message to the nation was clear. The American spirit was restored, and it was being delivered by Anheuser-Busch. The factory roared back to life with a vengeance. The smell of hops returned to the air, thicker than ever. But the company that emerged from Prohibition was different. It was tougher and more diversified. They had learned that they couldn't rely on just one product. As they ramped up production, they began to embrace the next great shift in American culture: the metal can. Until now, beer was a social event at a tavern or a luxury in a glass bottle. But with the invention of the canned beer in the mid-30s, the brewery could now reach the blue-collar worker's refrigerator directly. The St. Louis plant became a masterclass in logistics. They weren't just brewing. They were canning, bottling, and shipping at a speed that would have made Adolphus Busch's head spin. The Red Castle had survived the desert of Prohibition, and now it was preparing to flood a thirsty, post-depression America with a golden wave of lager. The king wasn't just back on the throne, he was building a bigger palace. By the 1950s, the world was changing, and the Red Castle in St. Louis was changing with it. America had entered a golden age of consumerism, and the brewery was about to move from the back of a horse-drawn wagon into the living rooms of every home in the country. This was the era of the Great Expansion, led by the larger-than-life Gussie Busch. Gussie realized that to stay the king, he needed more than just a great factory. He needed to dominate the new medium of television. The brewery became one of the first true masters of marketing. They didn't just sell beer, they sold the American weekend. They sponsored sports, variety shows, and of course, they made the Clydesdales the most famous horses on the planet through cinematic holiday commercials. Inside the St. Louis walls, the 1950s and 60s brought a technological explosion. The manual labor of the past was being replaced by high-speed automation. The bottling lines became a blur of silver and glass, moving at speeds that were once thought impossible. They built new, massive stockhouses, giant, temperature-controlled skyscrapers of steel and concrete, to house the millions of gallons of beer aging in beechwood chip. But Gussie Busch knew that a king needed to care for his kingdom. He bought the St. Louis Cardinals baseball team, saving them from moving to another city, and built Busch Stadium. The connection between a cold Budweiser and a day at the ballpark became a sacred American ritual. The factory wasn't just producing a beverage anymore, it was producing the soundtrack to the American summer. For the workers, this was the height of the company man era. A job at the brewery was a golden ticket. It meant a high wage, incredible benefits, and a sense of pride that was unparalleled in the Midwest. Generations of families, grandfathers, fathers, and sons, all walked through the same red brick gate. The St. Louis plant had become the hub of a national network. As they built new breweries in Los Angeles, Newark, and Miami, they all looked to the mothership in St. Louis for the secret sauce. The yeast, the water standards, and the legend all flowed from that single 142-acre fortress. Anheuser-Busch wasn't just a business. It was a cultural superpower, sitting at the intersection of sports, family, and the thriving American middle class. By the 1970s and 80s, the Red Castle had achieved something few factories ever do. It had turned a craft into a perfect, repeating science. While the craft beer movement was still decades away from the mainstream, Anheuser-Busch was perfecting the art of mass consistency. Whether you opened a Budweiser in a dive bar in Maine or a beach shack in California, it had to taste exactly the same. and that consistency was guarded by the walls of the St. Louis plant like a state secret. This era was defined by the legendary beechwood aging process. If you stepped into the maturation cellars of the St. Louis Brewery during this time, you'd see something unique in the world of industrial manufacturing. Inside massive horizontal tanks, thousands of sanitized beechwood chips were layered at the bottom. This wasn't for flavor, beechwood is neutral, but for surface area. It gave the yeast a place to rest, allowing it to work more efficiently to create that crisp, clean finish that became the Budweiser signature. The factory became a marvel of biological engineering. Every day, the taste panel, a group of master brewers with palates as sensitive as fine-tuned instruments, would sit in a quiet room in the heart of the complex. They would sample the water, the wort, and the finished beer from every stage of the process. If a single batch was even a fraction off the North Star profile, it was discarded. In a facility that produced millions of barrels, there was zero room for error. But the 80s also brought a new kind of competition. The light beer wars had begun. The St. Louis plant had to adapt again, launching Bud Light in 1982. The engineers had to figure out how to strip away calories while keeping the soul of the lager intact. It was a massive gamble that required retooling assembly lines and recalibrating the very chemistry of the brewery. As the decade closed, the Red Castle was no longer just a brewery. It was a high-tech laboratory wrapped in 19th-century brick. It was the most efficient beer-making machine on the planet. The Busch family still sat in the wood-paneled offices, overseeing an empire that now controlled nearly 50% of the American beer market. They were the undisputed heavyweights of the industry, seemingly untouchable, fueled by massive Super Bowl ad budgets and a distribution network that reached every corner of the globe. But in the world of global business, being the biggest often makes you the biggest target. For over a century, the Busch family ruled the Red Castle with an iron hand and a paternal heart. They had survived prohibition, wars, and economic depressions, always emerging stronger. But by the early 2000s, the world of business was no longer about family legacies. It was about global consolidation. The king of beers was about to find out that in the eyes of Wall Street, even a kingdom is just an asset. The tension inside the St. Louis headquarters was palpable. While Budweiser and Bud Light still dominated the shelves, the market was shifting. Younger drinkers were moving toward craft beers or spirits, and the massive overhead of the sprawling St. Louis fortress was becoming a target for investors. The fourth generation of the family, led by Adolphus Busch IV, was struggling to maintain the same magic that had propelled his ancestors. Then, in 2008, the same year the global economy began to fracture, the unthinkable happened. A Brazilian-Belgian giant called InBev launched a hostile takeover bid. It was a $52 billion play for the soul of American brewing. To the people of St. Louis, this felt like an invasion. Protests erupted outside the red brick gates, signs reading "Save Bud" and "Keep the King" hung from local porches. For many, Anheuser-Busch wasn't just a company. It was a part of the American identity, as vital as baseball or the flag. But the logic of the stock market is cold. Despite the family's desperate attempts to block the sale, the board eventually accepted the offer. The era of the Busch dynasty was over. The takeover brought a culture shock that rocked the factory to its foundation. The new owners, 3G Capital, were famous for zero-based budgeting. They weren't interested in the Gilded Age opulence or the expensive perks of the past. They looked at the Red Castle and saw waste. They cut thousands of jobs, sold the family's private jets, and even stopped the free beer privileges for employees. The Red Castle remained standing, and the beer kept flowing, but the spirit of the place had fundamentally changed. It was no longer a family kingdom. It was the crown jewel of a global corporation called AB InBev. The factory was more profitable than ever, but for the first time in 150 years, the decisions that affected the streets of St. Louis were being made in boardrooms thousands of miles away in Belgium and Brazil. Today, the Red Castle on the Mississippi stands as a bridge between two worlds. The smokestacks still rise over South St. Louis, and the smell of boiling hops still hangs in the Missouri air, but inside, the 19th century brickwork hides a 21st century brain. The brewery is no longer just a monument to the past. It is a high-speed, data-driven marvel that would look like science fiction to Adolphus Busch. If you walk the floors now, you'll see the same copper kettles, but they are monitored by complex algorithms and AI that can detect a microscopic change in the yeast's health. The bottling lines move with such terrifying speed they appear as a solid blur of amber glass, producing enough beer in a single day to fill an Olympic-sized swimming pool. The factory has become a leader in sustainability, using massive solar arrays and water recovery systems to ensure the king of beers leaves a smaller footprint on the earth. But for all the technology, some things remain untouchable. The house of the Clydesdales still stands. The massive horses still live in their mahogany stalls, and their hooves still strike the cobblestones with that same thunderous rhythm. They remain the living, breathing heart of the brand, a reminder that in an age of instant gratification and digital noise, some things must still be done with patience and care. The St. Louis Brewery has also become a guardian of the craft movement it once tried to ignore. The complex now incubates smaller brands, using its massive distribution muscle to bring new flavors to the world, while the master brewers still gather every morning for the daily taste panel, the same ritual that has guided the flavor of Budweiser for over a century. As the sun sets over the Mississippi, hitting the red brick towers of the brew house, you realize that this place is more than a factory. It is a survivor. It survived the death of its founders, the drought of Prohibition, the chaos of global takeovers, and the changing tastes of a new generation. The Anheuser-Busch Brewery remains the mothership. It is a testament to the idea that a factory can be a community, a castle, and a cathedral all at once. The Busch family name may no longer be on the deed, but their spirit is baked into the very mortar of the walls. The king of beers hasn't just held on to his throne. He has turned his fortress into a landmark that reminds us that while empires may change hands, a truly great legacy is never truly finished. The gates are open, the boilers are hot, and the story is still being brewed.